Thank you all for having me. I actually appreciate you going first because you set me up very nicely to talk about some of the things I'm going to discuss this morning. So I wrestled a little bit with how to actually present to everyone this morning. I thought I might not talk about myself so much, and now I'm thinking that might be what you want me to do a little bit. I don't know. So I'll talk a little bit about my background and how I kind of arrived where I am. And then actually some of the things I'm going to talk about dovetail very nicely into what Dr. Kaufman spoke on this morning about psychological assessment. My area of expertise is in doing that with children. So to build a little bit off of what Dr. Osborne just mentioned, I graduated from the combined program in 2004. Prior to that, I actually did my bachelor's degree here at FSU in just general psychology, and I was 100% convinced I wanted to be a forensic psychologist. And then it kicked in. You're probably not going to be the person on Criminal Minds who's doing the fun criminal profiling. Not going to happen. You're going to do competency evaluation. Yeah, right. Well, then I even thought, great, I can do competency evaluations. That's going to be great too. And then I had the misfortune of having to go to court to testify for a friend of mine who was in a pretty nasty custody battle. And I remember clearly walking into the courtroom and clearly walking out and nothing in between, because I had I thought if I'm going to have a panic attack, it's going to be right now, because I had such anxiety about walking into that courtroom and testifying. And so I thought maybe I shouldn't do that for a living. So I've become more comfortable talking in front of people and with parents, but it's taken some time to do that. So the idea of testifying was not so good for me. So then I thought, you know what, I'm going to do the combined counseling and school psychology program, and I'm going to be the counselor. That was going to be what I was doing. I was going to be the 50-minute-hour therapist. I was going to do the therapy. I felt really confident about doing that. And then I took my first course and fell in love with school psychology. So as much as I very much appreciate counseling psychology, and I'm not allowed to not know about counseling as a psychologist, clearly I have to know best practices and empirical supported methods, but I really do love assessment, and I really do love kids, and so that's really where I've kind of carved out life for myself. So I'm over at the Multidisciplinary Center. I have a few faces in the audience I recognize from recent practicum evaluations, so they can tell you a little bit more about what the Multi-Center does. But I started off there doing consultative services, and so working a lot with schools and kind of wrapping our heads around what it meant to do consultation with children and with schools. Not as much assessment in the beginning, but I would say the pendulum has really shifted back to doing more assessments, and I'm very comfortable with that, which is a good thing. I also stumbled my way into being the co-director of the autism evaluation clinic that we have there. And my first few brushes with autism were actually a little bit anxiety-provoking because they were pretty severe cases. Most of the kids were pretty nonverbal, and they were asking me to do this huge battery of assessments that just weren't going anywhere. And so as I've become more comfortable and we've kind of broadened our lens about what autism is, I've really fallen in love with this population. So I spend a lot of time doing identification for autism. And those are a couple of the case studies that I'm going to present to you guys this morning, just so I don't have to talk about myself for a full 20 minutes. And then I'm also now the director of our internship training program there. And this is a relatively new role for me. This is the third year that I've done that. And so we recruit psychology interns from across the nation to come spend a year with us. And we train them how to be good child psychologists. Our firm belief is if you're going to work with children, you're going to be a child psychologist of any sort, you really do need to understand how schools work, because that's where they spend most of their time. So that's a little bit about me. I'm actually dual licensed as a general psychologist and a school psychologist, so that's fun. I get double the CEUs and twice the payment of the license, but it's good, it's worth it. But the clientele that I'm primarily working with, both in terms of who I'm training other people to work with and what I do personally, spans the range of 3 to 22, and only 22 because you can technically stay in public school until you're 22. But typically we're more on the 18 is kind of the cap where we're really working, and we'll go down as low as 3 years old. So your typical types of assessments, kind of building off some of the stuff Dr. Kaufman talked about, we have your psychoeducational assessment, and so I'm going to linger here for a few minutes and kind of talk about the spirit of what the topic is with assessment and psychology, and use a couple of case examples to illustrate some things that have been very meaningful to me in terms of the importance of doing assessment with psychology. So your traditional psychoeds, your IQ, achievement, processing, some behavior checklists, adaptive measures, parent-teacher interviews, and so forth. You have your more specific ASD assessments, which encompass all those traditional psychoeducational measures, as well as those that are more specialized toward looking at autism. So the ADOS, the social communication questionnaire, et cetera. And then you have your traditional school-based assessment. So these are the things we're engaging in on a pretty regular basis. But the question always comes up, and this actually came up with one of my mentors a long time ago when I was in the program. Why do we need people who just do assessments? And this is where you set me up very nicely. Thank you. Because assessment is going to tell us how to intervene. And this is very much building off of the message Dr. Kaufman is giving you. It's very easy to go in with an idea, a preconceived notion about what this particular individual needs. But without good assessment, you really are flying a little bit blind. And so a good assessment can guide your therapeutic and educational intervention, coming at it, of course, from the school side of things. Educational difficulties have lots of root causes. I'll show you a couple of very brief, not so interesting, but relevant examples about looking at educational assessment, understanding how to intervene academically. Same kind of thing happens with behavioral manifestations of behavior, and this is very similar to what we just talked about with you in terms of the origin of behavior and how you proceed with treatment. And then something I like to tell parents, and if you've ever overheard me on a phone call with a parent when I'm talking to someone who has some anxiety about doing an evaluation with their child, my interest is not necessarily to diagnose per se. I want to give you an idea of strengths and weaknesses. It may or may not need a diagnosis yet. With children, assessment is like hitting a moving target. Things are changing daily. What I'm going to see now is going to look very different 3 years from now, and I'm going to give you a couple cases to illustrate that point. So let's talk about the educational difficulties. This is probably my driest section here. But looking at educational difficulties, you have to understand our schools, there's a really heavy focus on prevention of academic difficulties and early intervention. And so we're trying to do a much better job of targeting our intervention. A very, very long time ago, predating all of us back in graduate school, there was a really big push to look at this, what they called aptitude by treatment interactions. What are these underlying skills that are then causing these learning difficulties? And then we swung the other way and said, no, we don't really care about the underlying stuff. We just care if you can't read, we're gonna get in there and do reading interventions. We've kind of swung back to the middle. There is a need to understand the origin of some of these behavioral difficulties and educational difficulties because it then helps us be more prescriptive about what we do. So here's a good little kind of benign case. This little 9-year-old that came in, she's beginning 5th grader, reading difficulties. We actually ended up doing a couple of different assessments with her, both school-based and through the clinic. So on the left-hand side, you have our clinic information. On the right-hand side, you have the stuff that we did through school. So on the left side, it's your traditional Woodcock-Johnson. And if you take a look at those reading scores, the letter word identification, she's average, no real concerns there. Word attack's a little bit weak, so this is your phonics and phonetic decoding abilities, those precursors to being able to decode fluently. And then you have your fluency, how quickly you're reading, your comprehension, just kind of at the lower end of average range. But the traditional thing that happens when you see reading difficulties is it's really, really easy to go in and just add an intervention that looks honestly a lot of times at fluency. That is not what she needs. If you're looking over here on the right-hand side at what her academics look like, she's at or above where she should be for her ending 4th grade. We didn't have 5th grade yet. It was literally like the 2nd day of school. So we really could still look at 4th grade abilities. Her fluency was fine. So in terms of being more prescriptive, this is the kind of information we want to know so that we're putting our dollars and our time in the right spot to intervene for her. So I'm going to recommend that we intervene even lower in maybe some of those basic decoding kind of skills, as well as giving her some strategies for comprehension. Another more interesting example, so we talk about reading difficulties for an 11-year-old 6th grader. And so he came to the clinic to see me, and he had strong history of doing well. It's not really traditional of learning disabilities. A lot of times they show up a lot earlier than that because it's those basic skills. And he had been doing fine, and all of a sudden we hit the end of 5th grade and he's having a hard time with reading, and his standardized test scores are starting to tank. Nothing below a B in terms of his grades, but he's working really hard. And in the interview that we did, he's saying, I'm having a hard time with the reading. It's not so much that I can't really comprehend it, I just can't remember everything I'm supposed to read. Like, ding, ding, ding. So, here's his reading scores, all fine. I mean, 120, word attack, he's doing great, everything's average or above. And then I'm looking over here at IQ stuff, and you can't make a whole lot of extrapolation just off of an IQ test number, but if you look at his memory is in the 70s. His speed is in the 70s, and that's consistent no matter what measure I gave him. So his qualitative report of I can't remember what I'm reading matches up perfectly here. This is not a reading disability in the traditional sense. This is something I can make some accommodation suggestions for. Shorter passages, take more frequent breaks, use your outlines, use your post-it notes, whatever you have to do to support and supplement the memory, because the comprehension is fine. You're understanding just perfectly what you're reading. So my intervention strategies for both of these students is very, very difficult. Where hers was, let's get in here and remediate some skills. His is, the skills are fine. It's some of these other things that we can do to accommodate where these difficulties are for you so that learning is not as much of a challenge. So in terms of assessment with education, these are the kinds of things that we're being asked to do, is to understand the origin of the difficulties so we can make better recommendations. So from the behavioral manifestation end of things, why is assessment important with kids? So as is true with adults, you can get a list of, here's my primary concern. It's test anxiety, or they seem, to have some depression, or maybe there's some social difficulties. More commonly for me, I'll get a referral from a district or an agency that says, we suspect this child has autism spectrum disorder or ADHD. Core set of symptoms, can't focus, can't sit still, etc. So here's a case of a 9-year-old boy. He was referred for autism spectrum disorder testing. So per parent interview and per the school report, we have these list of features. He's got a limited desire for affection, even as an infant. Even now at 9, he's not overly affectionate, not super friendly, delayed with his language acquisition. All these things to me are like, okay, this sounds like maybe autism spectrum. He had some regression in his skills. He had lost bowel and bladder control around age 4, had lots of food rules and selectivity, a lot of rigidity in his behavior. Obviously some academic difficulties. He'd had trouble making friends, preferred to be alone, lots of bullying, language difficulties, struggled with change. I mean, this is ticking off all those autism spectrum categories for me. Is anyone kind of familiar with the autism spectrum? Okay, so does this kind of sound like the spectrum to you? Did to me too. So we start doing a little bit more assessment, and actually not so much autism spectrum. The more we learn, the more we find out there's a little bit more to it than this. So we found out through Mom's interview that she had had pretty significant drug use prior to becoming pregnant with him. She abstained during the pregnancy, and then pretty much immediately after he was born, the drug use started again. So I'm not really sure what a good judge she is about how affectionate he was as an infant, because I'm not really sure how engaged she was. Around age 7, he had made a suicide attempt. It was actually very upsetting to hear about it. He was in the classroom, and he had taken some cord, I guess, from his grandmother's sewing materials and had wrapped it around his throat in the classroom, and the teacher sees him turning blue in the back. This is a big deal and scared everyone to death, which is part of the reason why he got referred pretty quickly to come for an evaluation. So he had also started pulling out all his hair in the front of his head, eyelashes and eyebrows included. So there was some social stuff there. He's obviously not super engaged because whatever's going on with him is pretty traumatic and upsetting, and he's not really putting out that I'm feeling super friendly vibe if you're pulling all of your hair out. He had a lot of aggression, and it increased pretty significantly, including pulling a knife on his sister and threatening her life. Mom had gotten to the point where she was sleeping with the door open in her house so she could hear if he got up in the middle of the night, for fears about not only his safety but the family's safety. And of course had a decreased need for sleep with a lot of irritability, lots of nightmares. He had come in, very much like what Dr. Coppin said, in our community mental health settings, a lot of times time is not on their side. So you're taking the first few things that the parent can present to you. I understand that there's some utility. You've got a lot of clients with a lot of needs. And so you're taking the first couple things that are said and making your diagnosis. He had come in with diagnoses of bipolar, ADHD. He'd had numerous medications attempted, Risperdal, Abilify, Focalin, a couple of anti-anxieties, et cetera, as well as your stimulant medications. And he was looking very mixed bag to us in terms of all these different diagnoses that could be possible for him. But there was one major elephant in the room that no one knew about, and that if we had not done the assessment, we wouldn't have known either. he had witnessed his sister being sexually abused right there next to him on an air mattress that they shared at a step-grandparent's house. That grandparent was in jail, so we knew they were no longer in any imminent danger, but it really derailed him in every possible way. So all of that regression, all of that aggression, all of that anxiety, stress, nightmares, lack of being engaged, explained by these types of events. Kids can't go through that kind of trauma without it altering who they are in a lot of ways. It can really derail a lot of stuff that happens for you. So it's a terribly sad case, but one that if we had just taken the basic referral and gone forward for recommending treatment, we would have been so far off base. It was not even close to accurate. It's not spectrum at all. It's all of the trauma. I'll give you another one, and this is one of my more favorite examples to talk about in terms of illustrating the idea of assessment with children being a moving target. So children are in the process of growing and developing. So if you work with adults, so much of what you do is looking retrospectively at onset of behavior, past experience. Past behavior is a great predictor of future and current behavior. With kids, you don't have a lot of past behavior, so you're pretty reliant on your interviewers or interviewees, your parents, whatever information you can glean from their current presentation. But they're growing, changing, and developing, and it's not outside the realm of possibility for us to begin to see some of those root behaviors that may not meet full diagnostic criteria for something yet. It's also very important for us to be thoughtful about that, because adding medications into a changing biochemistry can certainly alter the pathway of where that biochemistry would have gone. So you have to be very thoughtful when you're working with children. So here's a great example. We had a 10-year-old little boy come in referred for just behavioral concerns. We had very little developmental information prior to age 3 because he had been adopted. He'd been removed from his biological family because of issues of neglect. Back in preschool, they'd had behavioral concerns for him, hitting, not listening. Those got worse in kindergarten and first grade, became more argumentative, difficulty following directions and staying on task. He'd been given a provisional diagnosis of ADHD, and then they started the stimulant medications. That's pretty common for them to go ahead and start doing the stimulants. And they'd had some negative side effects. They tried many different medications. They finally settled on Vyvanse. And then he was evaluated in 2009 by the school psychologist, who I know and love. She did a wonderful job with him. They identified learning disability for him and then formally did the diagnosis of ADHD. He was then sent to Shands, so our teaching hospital down in Gainesville, and they were concerned with poor anger control, more temper outbursts, difficulty with peers, adjustment issues in general. They increased the Vyvanse and added a second stimulant because Vyvanse just wasn't doing the trick. And they sent him to us. We think it's autism spectrum. It was not. We were able to rule that out pretty solidly, but we weren't quite sure what it was. So we, of course, during the time of looking retrospectively, one of the things we saw from him is this tendency to engage in really exaggerated storytelling. He did that even with the examiner. He was doing that with peers. It was kind of off-putting to peers. Peers thought he was kind of a liar. They didn't really want to hang out with somebody who just made up all these fanciful stories that couldn't possibly be true. There were some sleep difficulties at the time, as well as some of that continued stubbornness, irritability, temper tantrums, and so on. They added Celexa in 3rd grade because it's still those stimulants just weren't doing the trick. It was to manage more anxiety testing. There was no formal testing done. It was just added based again on parent report of what was happening at home. And by the end of the year, his behavior had, again, skyrocketed a little bit more, and so they upped the stimulants again. So the beginning of 4th grade, they start seeing odd behavior. So at the end of 3rd grade, they've upped all these stimulants. They've seen this kind of more aggressive behavior. So then they're seeing what they're calling odd behavior in 4th grade. His storytelling was more elaborate and exaggerated. He ended up bringing a knife to school. He was suspended, and then within 2 weeks, he'd had another incident where he was talking about killing at school, and so the school panicked. I would too. Anytime someone's talking about death and dying, be it their own or someone else's, it sends an anxiety response. So we brought him in for the evaluation, and during that evaluation, he was actively hallucinating. And I was able to watch some of this evaluation. As a supervisor, he was having a conversation with a fictional character. It was Dracula. He was having a conversation with Dracula. He was standing outside the door and feeding him information. He had this very wild story about how he was not sleeping at night. He was out hunting, and he'd been given this mission. He'd been tasked to help them, take care of all the bad guys at school. And it was really one of my first times seeing someone that actively psychotic. And it was a little bit unnerving because my thought had always been is if someone's having, hallucinations, they're frightened by it. And that was not the case at all. He was very comfortable with this, and his thread of thinking was clearly disordered, but it was very consistent in what he reported. So there were no lies. This was not purposeful. This was his reality. And so we really wrestled with what to do. And one of the questions that I think we still kind of wrestled with is which came first? Was it the psychosis or was it mood? Because he had both. And both, we have no doubt, were triggered by the increase in medications and the mismanagement of medications, all by very well-meaning and people that I respect a great deal, professionals. So it was just a matter of what they were presented with and how much time they had to actually spend delving into what might be going on for him. So we ended up with a provisional diagnosis of mood disorder with psychotic features most likely triggered by the stimulant medications. It's very possible that these are things that could have erupted later. Like if this really is a mood disorder, he may have looked more mood disordered as he had gotten older in 4th grade. Now we have all these developmental things. We haven't fully manifested the symptoms, and let's add these medications that trigger and turn on genes that weren't supposed to be turned on yet. And so we have a little bit of a mixed bag on what to do with him. But the take-home message for all of those cases is don't ever doubt the utility of a thorough assessment. It's really, really important to be thoughtful. Not everything necessarily has to have a diagnosis, but you do need to be able to give direction to the people who are going to come behind you or to you if you're actually doing treatment and intervention. I'm out of time. So I will stop there. Thank you all very much.